The hospital smelled of antiseptic and hope, a combination Maggie Sullivan had grown accustomed to over her 30 years as a nurse. At 52, she stood in the cardiac ward of St. Mary's Medical Center, her hands steady as she adjusted the drip for a patient recovering from bypass surgery. Her navy scrubs were crisp, her dark hair pulled into a neat bun, and her eyes carried the quiet wisdom of someone who'd seen both miracles and tragedies. It was 1994, and Maggie was in the prime of her career, her life comfortably predictable. She'd been married to David Sullivan, a brilliant but reserved engineer, for 22 years. Their life together was steady, not flashy, built on mutual respect and quiet evenings spent reading or gardening. But beneath the surface, there was a fault line Maggie had learned to navigate carefully. David's 2 children from his first marriage, Laura and Michael. David's first wife, Susan, had left when Laura was 10 and Michael was 8, citing irreconcilable differences and a desire for a life less tethered. David, ever practical, had taken full custody, raising his children with a methodical devotion that matched his engineering blueprints. When Maggie met him at 30, volunteering at a community health fair, she was drawn to his quiet strength and dry humor. He'd been upfront about his children from the start, and Maggie, who'd always wanted a family but hadn't found the right partner, saw an opportunity to build something meaningful. She didn't expect it to be easy, but she hadn't anticipated how hard Laura and Michael would fight to keep her at arm's length. Check if you're subscribed to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. We love to know how far our stories are reaching. David arrived first, his tie loosened and his graying hair slightly disheveled. "Smells amazing, Mags," he said, kissing her cheek. At 55, he was still handsome, with sharp blue eyes and a smile that crinkled at the corners. "Laura coming?" "She said she would," Maggie replied, stirring the gravy. Michael didn't answer. David's face tightened, a familiar shadow passing over it. "They're adults now. They make their own choices." Maggie nodded, but her heart ached. She'd spent years trying to connect with Laura and Michael, baking cookies for their school events, attending their soccer games, and offering to help with homework. But Laura, fiercely loyal to her absent mother, had always been cold, her politeness sharp-edged. Michael was quieter, less confrontational, but his silence was its own kind of wall. Maggie had hoped time would soften them, but at 22 years of marriage, she was still Dad's wife, never Mom. The doorbell rang and Laura swept in, her blonde hair pulled into a tight ponytail, her business suit immaculate. She worked as a junior accountant, her ambition as fierce as her mother's had been. "Hey, Dad," she said, hugging David. To Maggie, she offered a curt nod. "Maggie." "Thanks for coming, Laura," Maggie said, keeping her voice warm. "Dinner's almost ready." They sat, the conversation stilted at first. David talked about his bridge project. Maggie shared a funny story about a patient who'd insisted on singing show tunes during a procedure, and Laura offered clipped updates about her job. Maggie noticed Laura's eyes scanning the room, lingering on the new curtains Maggie had sewn. "Those are nice," Laura said, her tone neutral but her eyes calculating. "Thanks," Maggie replied. "I made them last weekend. Thought the room needed a little color." Laura nodded, then turned to David. "Dad, have you thought about what we discussed?" "About the house." Maggie's fork paused midair. She knew what was coming. Laura had been pushing David to put the house in a trust for her and Michael, a topic that had surfaced more frequently since David's recent promotion had boosted his income. Maggie had overheard Laura on the phone with Michael once, saying, "We need to make sure it stays in the family." The implication was clear. Maggie wasn't family. David sighed, setting down his glass. "Laura, we've been over this. The house is Maggie's and mine. We'll decide what happens to it." "It's just practical, Dad," Laura pressed. "Mom always said this place was special. It's where we grew up." Maggie's chest tightened. Susan's shadow loomed large, even 16 years after she'd left. Maggie had spent years maintaining the house, painting walls, tending the garden, making it her own while respecting its history. But to Laura, it was still Mom's house. "I understand it's special," Maggie said gently. but I've been taking care of it for years. Those roses out back? I've nurtured them since I moved in. Laura's eyes narrowed. Mom planted those roses, and I've kept them alive, Maggie replied, her voice steady. I'm not trying to erase your mother, Laura. I'm just living here, too. The silence was heavy. David reached for Maggie's hand under the table, a quiet show of support. Laura's jaw tightened, but she dropped the subject. The rest of the dinner passed without incident, though Maggie felt the weight of Laura's resentment like a storm cloud. Later, as she washed dishes, David joined her at the sink. I'm sorry about that, Mags. She's just protective. Maggie rinsed a plate, her hands methodical. She's protecting something that doesn't need protecting. I'm not here to take anything from them. I know, David said, his voice soft. They'll come around. They just need time. Maggie wanted to believe him, but she'd heard that promise for years. She dried her hands and looked out the kitchen window at the roses, their petals glowing under the moonlight. Sometimes, David, time just makes people dig in deeper. Over the next few years, Maggie's life with David settled into a rhythm. She was promoted to head nurse, a role that demanded long hours but gave her purpose. David's engineering firm thrived, and they began investing together, building a modest but secure financial portfolio. Maggie was meticulous with money, a habit born from her working-class upbringing. She'd seen too many patients lose everything to medical debt, and she was determined to never be in that position. Laura and Michael grew more distant. Laura married a lawyer named Greg, and they bought a condo downtown. Michael moved to Chicago for a tech job, visiting only for holidays. When they did come home, their interactions with Maggie were polite but distant. Laura's comments about the house never stopped, though they became subtler, cloaked in suggestions about preserving family legacy. Michael, meanwhile, seemed to withdraw further, answering Maggie's attempts at conversation with one-word responses. In 1998, tragedy struck. David suffered a heart attack while working late at the office. Maggie was on shift when the call came, and she rushed to the ER, her nurse's instincts warring with her panic as a wife. By the time she reached him, he was gone. The doctors said it was sudden, painless. Maggie sat by his body, holding his hand, feeling the weight of 26 years together collapse into a single moment. The funeral was a blur. Laura and Michael were there, grief-stricken but distant. Maggie organized everything, from the service to the reception at the house. She expected their coldness, but was unprepared for Laura's comment as guests left. Dad would have wanted Mom's roses at the service. You should have asked us. Maggie bit back a retort. She'd chosen lilies because David had loved them, a detail Laura wouldn't know because she hadn't been around for their quiet mornings in the garden. Instead, Maggie said, I chose what he loved. I'm sorry if that wasn't right. Laura didn't respond, but her silence spoke volumes. The will reading was another blow. David had left the house and most of his assets to Maggie, with a smaller portion divided between Laura and Michael. Maggie had known about the arrangement. They discussed it years ago, but Laura's reaction was explosive. This is our family home, she'd shouted at the lawyer's office. She's not even blood. The lawyer, a kind man named Mr. Thompson, explained that David's wishes were clear and legally binding. Maggie sat silently, her hands folded, feeling like an intruder in her own life. Michael, to his credit, didn't argue, but his quiet acceptance felt more like resignation than support. In the months that followed, Maggie threw herself into work and her garden. The roses became her refuge, each bloom a reminder of her resilience. She sold the house, not because of Laura's pressure, but because it felt too big without David. She bought a smaller cottage, one with a sunny backyard perfect for gardening, and invested the proceeds wisely. Laura called once, asking if Maggie would consider sharing the sale profits. Maggie declined politely, saying, David wanted me to be secure. That's what I'm doing. By 2000, Maggie was 58, financially independent, and rebuilding her life. She volunteered at a community center, teaching gardening classes, and found joy in helping others discover the peace she'd found in her roses. She dated briefly, but found most men her age wanted someone to play a role she wasn't interested in filling. She was content alone, her life full with work, friends, and her garden. Then, in 2001, she met William Henderson at a charity gala for the hospital. He was 60, a widower with a gentle smile and a passion for literature. They bonded over a shared love of roses. His late wife, Eleanor, had been a gardener, too. William was upfront about his 3 children, Patricia, Robert, and Jennifer, and their loyalty to their mother's memory. Maggie listened, her heart both hopeful and cautious. She'd been through this before. As their relationship grew, Maggie saw echoes of her past. William's children were polite but guarded, their smiles never reaching their eyes. At their first family dinner, Patricia thanked Maggie for the pie she'd brought, then set it aside untouched. Robert answered her questions with grunts. Jennifer talked endlessly about Eleanor, weaving stories that excluded Maggie entirely. But Maggie was different now. She'd learned from Laura and Michael that love couldn't be forced, only earned. She didn't push, didn't try to win them over with grand gestures. Instead, she focused on William, building a quiet, steady life with him. When William proposed in 2002, Maggie hesitated. Not because she didn't love him. She did, deeply, but because she knew what came with marrying a man with grown children. She sat him down one evening in her garden, the Queen Elizabeth roses blooming pink against the sunset. "William," she said, "your kids don't like me. They never will. I've been through this before, and I need to know you'll stand by me." William took her hand, his eyes steady. "Maggie, I see how they treat you. I won't let them push you out. You're my partner, not a placeholder." They married in a small ceremony, with only close friends and William's sister, Dorothy, in attendance. Maggie wore a simple cream dress, a single-piece rose tucked into her hair. She felt lighter than she had in years, but she braced herself for the storm she knew was coming. Over the next 8 years, William's children tested her resilience in ways Laura and Michael never had. Patricia's snide comments, Robert's dismissive silences, Jennifer's outright hostility. They were sharper, more deliberate. But Maggie was no longer the hopeful 30-year-old trying to win over stepchildren. She was 63, a woman who'd built the life through loss and perseverance. She'd learned to hold her ground, to tend her roses, to love fiercely without apology. When William was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in 2010, Maggie saw the shift in his children's behavior, the sudden visits, the questions about his will, the veiled accusations. She recognized the playbook from her years with Laura and Michael. But this time, she wasn't just a bystander. William confided in her, shared his plans, his disappointment in his children's greed. He wrote the letter, recorded the videos, and ensured his wishes were ironclad. Maggie didn't ask him to do it. She only asked him to be sure. As she stood by his side through chemotherapy, holding his hand at 3 a.m. when the pain kept him awake, Maggie thought of David, of the roses she'd tended for him, of the lessons she'd learned about family and resilience. She wasn't a gold digger, never had been. She was a woman who'd built her life brick by brick, who'd loved 2 good men, who'd faced rejection and kept going. And when the time came, at William's funeral, when Jennifer sneered and called her an outsider, Maggie was ready. The envelope she tossed on the table wasn't just William's revenge. It was the culmination of her own journey, a testament to the strength she'd forged through years of standing tall in the face of cruelty. In her garden, as she tended Eleanor's roses alongside her own, Maggie smiled. She'd survived Laura and Michael. She'd survived Patricia, Robert, and Jennifer. And she'd do it with the same grace and grit that had carried her through every storm. Check if you're subscribed to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. We love to know how far our stories are reaching.